Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome to the Cafe Muse Literary Salon. And thank you, Michael Davis, for that beautiful classical guitar performance. I'm Ellen Cole, and I'm hosting tonight along with our series founder, Karen Alanier, and our guest co-host, Susan Oki. Susan's stepping down this year as a regular co-host, and I want to thank her for serving as a Cafe Muse co-host for 8 amazing years. We'll miss her terribly, but hope to have her often introducing poets as a guest co-host. Our technical guru, Henry Crawford, is behind the scenes today. We're proud that Cafe Muse is entering its 24th year of outstanding literary programs. Our featured poets tonight are Leila, Chatti, and Majda Gama. Susan will introduce Leila, and I will introduce Majda. We encourage you to buy our featured authors' books tonight and to donate to Cafe Muse to support our literary programs. You can find the links for buying books and for making a donation in the chat. You may notice audience members have been muted. This will help prevent feedback problems for our readers and ensure uninterrupted programming. Please bear with us if we do encounter a technical glitch. During the reading, you may use the chat to comment or ask questions that our readers may answer during the Q&A period, which will be moderated by Karen Alanier if time permits. Our program is scheduled for 1 hour. Our next Cafe Muse reading will take place Monday, February 1, and will feature poets Sandra Beasley and Morris Manning. The WordWorks Poets versus the Pandemic program will be on Wednesday, January 12th at 7 o'clock, and will feature poet Sarah Maran with guest poets Sylvia Lady Di Beverly and Allison Palmer. And now, Susan will introduce Leila Chatti.
Thank you, Ellen, and good evening, everyone. At 22, poet Leila Chatti suffered the onset of torrential, continuous menstrual bleeding. Her mysterious illness became the occasion for Deluge, a mesmerizing poetry collection in which the speaker courageously explores the ways women and their bodies are blamed, feared, and controlled by society, whether in the Old and New Testaments, in the teachings of Islam, or in the modern medical system. She turns her experience and insights into endlessly inventive poetry, by turns funny, profound, frightened, angry, prayerful. In one poem, Mary in the waiting room at the gynecologist's office, the mother of Jesus, quote, presses her palm to the heat of her breast, turns to me and says, as if apologizing, I'm a little nervous. In another titled Mother, the speaker confesses, quote, what I wanted always to be, in control. And I knew this was impossible, just as I knew even then that to be a mother was to be the only permissible form of a woman. A Tunisian-American dual citizen who has lived in both of those countries plus France, Chatti draws startling images from both Islamic and Christian tradition. A visit home for Christmas begets a poem that pairs bleeding with caroling angels and a fevered Christmas rose, quote, the sky blushing as if shamed. The first poem in her collection teaches readers the Arabic word mubtadiya, meaning one who sees blood for the first time, as the speaker recalls the mixed religious messages that were associated with getting her first period. As a physician, I was both amused and pained by Chatti's poems about her encounters with the medical profession, embarrassing paper gowns, journeys into the innards of frightening machines, and looming tone-deaf male doctors like the one who asks endless variations on the phrase, how much blood would you say? More than an illness memoir, Deluge is a feminist meditation and a spiritual journey, offering lyric poems in a panoply of forms about universal subjects: love, sin, fertility, mortality, cultural taboos, faith and doubt, the nature of suffering. Chatti's sources include the Prophet Muhammad, Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, Lucille Clifton, Susan Sontag, and many others. Indeed, the title poem, the final one in the collection, is a tour de force composed of lines borrowed from 46 sources from all over the world. Leila Chatti has previously published 2 chapbooks, has received a Pushcart Prize, and teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she is the Mendota Lecturer in Poetry. Deluge, her first full collection, published by Copper Canyon Press in 2020, won the Leavis Reading Prize. It is a book to savor and return to. Friends, please welcome poet Leila Chatti.
Susan, thank you so much. That was the nicest introduction. You really just made my year. That was so lovely. Thank you all so much for coming. It's so wonderful to see so many people. This is wonderful. I haven't done a Zoom reading in some time now, so this feels really fun. It's a good way to start the year. I'm happy to be here with you all. Okay, I'm going to jump right in, and I tend to read kind of all in one go. I get a little shy, so I'll just read and then I'll be done. I'm going to start with the first poem, which is Confession, and it begins with an epigraph from the Quran when Mary's giving birth. She says, "Oh, I wish I had died before this and was in oblivion, forgotten. Truth be told, I like Mary a little better when I imagine her like this, crouched, boy God pushing on her cervix. I like remembering she had a cervix, her body ordinary and so like mine. Girl sweat lacing rivulets like veins in the sand, her small hands on her knees, not doves, but hands, gripping, a palm pressed to her spine, fronds whispering like voyeurs overhead. Oh, Mary, like a god, I too take pleasure in knowing you were not all holy that ache could undo you. I cannot. And suffering, I admire this girl who cared for a moment not about God or his plans, but her own distinct life. This fiercer Mary who'd disappear if it saved her, who'd howl to hell with salvation if it meant this pain. The blessed adolescent who squatted indignant in a desert, bearing his child like a secret she never wanted to hear. Mary speaks. And what could I say when he entered, rude as a dream, bare flame of a man with wings and demands not his own? I'd been raised a good girl, to house my tongue in my mouth, to be hospitable toward strangers, suspicious of no one. Perhaps I'd have been better off to be wary, but I'd been waiting so long to hear God speak, I hadn't thought to think of what he might tell me. Sarcoma. When the doctor says the word sarcoma, I consider how it might be a nice name for a daughter, that good feminine A, the way parents name their children for all sorts of inappropriate things. Apples, for instance, or the place where the baby was conceived. And I trace my fingers over the barrel of my belly as he speaks, flesh distended beneath the blue tissue I wear for a dress, an ideal grief frock, throwaway. And he says something about life expectancy, but of course I expect my life. So plain I thought nothing would ever take it. And while he explains, I cut my palms around my center, as if comforting a child, or covering her ears. Litany while reading scripture in the gynecologic oncology waiting room. And God said, let there be blood. And God said, flood. And God said, good is a woman with fruit in her womb and not in her hand. And God said, sin. And God did not say, forgive. And God said, I will make a stormy wind. And God said, sun, a breath stirring. And God said, highly favored. And God said, condemned. And God said, I will blot out man whom I have created, for I am sorry that I have made them. And God said, listen, and sank a boy in her like a stone. Mother, if you had asked me, 13, what I wanted to be one day, I wouldn't have said it. I wanted, for a long time, to be anything but myself, knew that a soon-to-be woman was the second worst thing in the world after a woman, full stop, and I was heading there fast. I could see it, my breasts rudely nudging into view, their snug caps like the knit caps of infants, rosy-colored as a tongue. And how terrifying, the thought of a mouth there, rooting in what could be drawn from me that I didn't need. What else skulked in me unseen, stirring in secret vats with milk yet untapped, and blood, the strange new wellspring? I was just beginning to understand the possibilities. My body's elusive, independent workings, machineries chugging away in dark chambers, not just left to, but simply their own devices, unknowable and sovereign. What I wanted always to be in control. And I knew this was impossible, just as I knew, even then, that to be a mother was to be the only permissible form of a woman, the begrudging exception to the rule of our worthlessness. So if you asked me again, 23, I tell you the worst thing you could be is not a woman, but barren, the industry shut down and the parts missing, malformed. And I tell you the shame of it, the feminine failure, its ache, a reminder, at the center, the tumor, ballooning, like hope. Tumor. On the scan, a monochrome nimbus of indiscernible material. My own, of course, but its intentions opaque. Its mouth, not a mouth, but a zero, a cipher, a space indicating a question it will not ask of itself. It requires me, like a child, to do another thing I'd rather not, to speak on its behalf, to determine its name so I might call it by it, so I might be accurate in my address. This precise knowing, something like tenderness, my obsessive attention and ersatz love, and I cannot turn away from it. Unblinking oculus of my center, blank eye staring from benthic depths. And while I'm at it, it resembles too, I think, a fruit if fruit were buried, a chthonic pomegranate, a Pompeian fig cocooned, or else the dark countenance of the moon, one of its seas, or the orphan planet of the dead, motherless stone, god of no and never. Angel. After a month of asking, suddenly a voice. It says you deserve that which has happened to you. It says, I see what you do with your long, terrain hands. Maundering through the banalities of my life, it follows, speaking, as if from a frosty bag of peas in the freezer aisle, speaking while I am on my knees, scrubbing the bathroom floor, trying to love a man. Its speech is disquieting company, but company nonetheless. The TV left on and turned low. It desperately wants my attention, but is polite, which is its defining weakness. Sometimes I catch it stirring out of the corner of my eye, a glint At the end of my cat's whiskers, a spangle on the ceiling of indiscernible source. More often, though, it looks like me, only a little off, like my reflection in the pregnant belly of a spoon. In fact, when I speak to it, I use my own name. I'm not sure if it minds. It repeats instead its refrain. It says, God has plans for you. It says, I didn't say they were good. Hymen. Second blood, I never knew you. After the first, scoured the bed for your blazoned blot and came up empty. Perhaps I was born without you. A box with no prize inside, a sundae with no cherry on top. God of good girls, God of matrimony, mother state, which I consider a distant country with a discordant tongue, did you speak with God and conclude I hadn't use for you? Once I was small as your kin, so small and for such a long time. Longer than I've lived, I fit inside my mother when she fit inside her mother, and so on and so forth, and further, a nest of matrons, these in a beam, in which to be female is to be something like infinity. And was it determined then what kind of woman I would be? It seems I've always been frightened, little veil, of wedlock's lock clicking shut, the heritable procession of women whispering in the aisle of my pulse, don't do, don't do, don't. And I haven't done. This, the gravamen, the grave I've dug with the spade of pleasure. But wanting seal of want, I did want it. Did choose to commit my life's greatest transgression with a benevolent accomplice, and so in the here before you could say I am among the spared. What a mess this messlessness of you could have been in any number of lives my size, billowing specters of dresses on a line of possibility, lives in which I am the bridesmaid and you, maidenhead, the bride given away, where I am the acquired property and you, the red ribbon severed in the threshold, I, the purse, and you, the coin tendered. Perhaps no one ever told you, precious emblem of innocence, simulacrum for honor, that some believe you the most important part of me, vital, like a heart a man gets the thrill of bursting where he can see it, that blood is owed to him. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Of a woman, you, the only blood worth anything. Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to just read two more and then hand it off to Majda, who I'm really excited to hear. Okay. Here we go. Questions directed toward the idea of Mary. Was it the voice you feared or its shadow? Did you long for his touch, or was suffering enough for you to know he was there? Do you resent me, my juvenile hungers? Do you wish for me the freedom of a vast, barren plain? What would you have done with your body if your body obliged? Did it please you, your sun risen at the end, like a question? Do you pity the angels, their ancillary lives? Did your worship falter once you were sure you were good? How long did you live before yielding to your inevitable shame? And how long before you realized? Did you realize? Shame was a blade You turned against yourself. And once you knew it, you could use it. Exegesis. I bled. God didn't want to hear about it. He said unclean, and so it was. He said it is harm, and so it was. Want to hear about it? He said unclean. Once a woman wanted, so he did her harm. And so it was first conceived, a woman suffering because a woman wanted. So he said, cursed. And then he said, blessed. The woman chose to suffer, conceived a God, though she never knew a man. And God knows best. If he calls a curse a blessing, then so it is. And he said she was clean. She never knew a man. I've known men, but never a God that bled and lived. But I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. That was wonderful. Amazing poems. Now, I'm delighted to introduce you to our next reader, my dear friend and fellow Cafe Muse co-host, poet Majda Gama. I first met Majda and got to know her poetry in a master class workshop we were both taking with Stanley Plumley. And I was floored by the beauty of her work, her exquisite images, the powerful compression of and deep understanding of language that elevates her poetry into something extraordinary. Majda is a Saudi American poet, and the literary traditions of both regions inform her poetry. She was born in Beirut, but has been based in the Washington area, where she has roots as a DJ and an activist. For the past 21 years, she has divided her time between DC and Dubai. She studied extensively with American University's David Kiplinger and with former Maryland Poet Laureate Stanley Plumley. Majda's poems have appeared widely in journals, including the Beloit Poetry Journal, Cordite, the Fairy Tale Review, Nimrod, the Normal School, Rhino, and The Shore, and has poetry forthcoming in the Michigan Quarterly Review and We Call to the Eve and the Night, an anthology of Arab love poetry. Majda is a pushcart, Best New Poets, and Best of the Net nominee, and a finalist in the Hayden Sperry Review's inaugural Poetry Prize. Her inaugural collection was a 2020 New Issues Poetry Prize finalist. Majda recently served as poetry editor for Tinderbox Poetry Journal and now is our newest co-host for the Cafe Muse Literary Salon online. Majda's poems are infused with exquisite images. In a poem called Tourist Welcome Center, men sit on an oriental carpet, desert fashion, and sip dark tea. A boy wearing a dish dash holds a bird on his wrist. The bird, a falcon in a hood and lightly bound by ropes, becomes a hieroglyph for the soul. The boy speaks his welcome in the words of the district of wind towers. In another poem, Ascenseur, the speaker remembers her grandmother and yearns for fragments of her beit, her house or household, her extended family. The poem is set in Beirut and Alexandria. Young uncles walk a Roman road past cafes serving kwawa and hand-pounded fruit tobacco. Hear the metronome sound of slippers ascending Alexandrian stairs. In an interview with the Fairy Tale Review, Majda talks about how she tries to use the aesthetics of Arab poetry when she places words in a sentence, and how in the Arabic language, a word in a poem can operate in different levels, creating a triple entendre instead of a double entendre. In her sonnet, British Museum Neolithic Deer Antlers Headdress, published by the Fairy Tale Review, Majda writes, "Skin and skull held words, words held worlds. The red deer hide, napped white, with slit eyes and horn points, is both crown and tool. The one who wore this mask took vows." In addition to the lovely slant rhymes, repetition, and assonance in the poem, Majda deftly uses multiple meanings layered beneath the word tool. In the interview I just cited, Majda tells us that the root word in Old Norse for tool is taw, which means to transform the skin of an animal into white leather by application of minerals, emulsions, etc. In her poem, the white leather skin of the deer is a tool itself, enabling the wearer to communicate with and metaphorically become the deer god. Man creates the tool creates the headdress, which crowns the man and is a tool that transforms the human into the divine. And words, of course, the tools of both the poet and the shaman, who transform the ordinary currency of everyday language into magic. Now I'm going to stop talking and let Majda read you her magical, many-layered, and very beautiful poems to you. I'm honored to present Majda Gama.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I'm floored by that. I just can't, yeah, that's beautiful. And wow, Leila, I've been waiting a long time to hear you read, and it was wonderful to do so, to hear that. I love that you're wearing red, Ellen. That's perfect for tonight. So I'll just dive right in then. I was in the Middle East quite recently. It's really difficult to travel. Obviously, everyone knows that, and you feel like you're taking quite a risk, but I mean, it was worth it. But I've been thinking a lot about how families like mine from the Middle East that are hybridized with Western mothers and you know, nationalities, how we end up having to migrate constantly for jobs, for education. Revolutions tend to push you out. Dictators tend to push you out. People disappear in the middle of the night. So I'm going to read poems of migration. The first poem is called In the City of Eve, and it's about my hometown of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And as a note, the name Jeddah means grandmother in Arabic, and that is why the city is known as the City of Eve, because Eve was supposedly buried there. In the City of Eve, 1. As a girl, I followed my father to our rooftop, up the narrow stairs, close to his white hem and dark slippers. The iron steps rang with the striking of our feet. He carried a telescope. The sky was clear, the moon in eclipse. The shadow did not bloody the surface. It smoked across the lunar terrain. We often stood on the rooftop. When the house was newly built, saw dogs running in the distance across the packed sand. I asked if they'd be safe. He said they would look after each other. In the time since, a thicket of jasmine formed along the border of our marble yard, and the air smelled sweet. 2. I learned the names of stars are in Arabic, constant and loyal like dogs. Algol, Arrakis, Deneb, Rigel, Vega. The skies turn sometimes. On a rooftop, when sand is loosened from the desert, it approaches like a red tide and cities drown. In my time, the deployment of armies would disturb the deep desert. My father took me to a dirt lot near the execution square, put me on his shoulders and pointed to the ruins there. Do you see the grave of Eve? The city turned. I have forgotten what I saw in the sand. Another poem about my home country or my fatherland. Kingdom 1980s. My country was young, so was I. Oil gushed out, diplomats rushed in. Mirrored skyscrapers filled the horizon, one mirage replaced by another. We recited Quran, sang Nasheed al-Watan every morning in the also young decade. The 1980s sprung neon along the Red Sea. And my thoughts revolved with smuggled new wave cassettes. My driver believed the tape deck malfunctioned when the Human League sang Love Action. The banishment of Madonna incited a run on hair dye. Like a virgin was haram, so I listened. Weren't we also shiny and new? Overnight, new roads led out of Jeddah. Asphalt untied the desert with long fingers. I was never born to drive it, so I dreamed from the back seat that the new airport and compounds would bring the world to me. Weren't we fresh? Weren't we ripe? We were richer, more fruitful than the top note, wafting off a flask of Drakkar Noir. So, as Ellen noted, I was born in Beirut, and that's not the only Middle Eastern country that I briefly inhabited. I didn't go back to Beirut until, well, I was practically 40. So the Civil War played out and my family didn't go back. So this is a poem about my family's relationship with Beirut and why I was likely born there. I'm going to dedicate it to my friend Jill Kitchen's father, George Kitchen. He likes to give me, he subscribes to the American University of Beirut magazine, and he likes to pass them on to me so I can read them and keep up with what's happening in Beirut. This is called The Eyelashes of a Century. No sweeter air than the breeze that brushes the ankles of the Lebanese women in their shift dresses and kitten heels as they walk the Corniche in the well-heeled Rausha district. Even the sun is reluctant to leave, lingering on the bare arms of couples, a prelude to the coming caress of a Beirut night. The smell of hot za'atar always in the air, and the soughing of the Mediterranean, always the water, flatter than an eye of unwinking turquoise, constant as the voice of Fayrouz, whose voice is wed to the city and the people. Her music drifts out of cafes, spreads a lithe body of oud strings and croon across the discotheques and lidos, in the debkiat of the wedding halls, where brides gift their loved ones with the sugared almonds made fashionable in France. Come the weekend, the city vacates to Tyre, where the small body of the murex snail gave the patricians the color purple, and the Phoenicians an empire so small and bright it was mistaken for a mote of light tangled in the eyelashes of a century. So, returning to Beirut about 40 years after I was born and not being from there, I still felt a curious relationship to the land, and it was hugely meaningful to me to go see, well, everything. Time is tricky there. And so this is a poem about that. It's called Into Baalbek. There are days of wonder when Hiraj drives us. He does almost convince us in a golden afternoon away from Beirut that a side trip to Damascus will be no problem. He'll drop us at the border. We'll take a taxi to the old quarter. Our journey is smooth out of Ashrafiyah, over the new concrete bridge into the flat green land of Baal. We leave the ghosts of snipers behind to meander through fields of young wheat and hashish, our route indirect to avoid bandits. This valley is a land of parallel gods, Bacchus and Maronite vineyards, Marian shrines and temple prostitutes, an ancient base of sun worshippers, now Hezbollah, and our white, unmarked minibus ticking through the wilds of the Beqa Valley to the Heliopolis. I crack nuts purchased in a Druze village and wait for the columns of Jupiter to appear. Well, I hope everybody's feeling like they're not surrounded by snow after hearing these Middle Eastern poems. Okay. You know what? My friend Iman Gota was originally scheduled to read tonight. Her debut book of fiction, Bride of the Sea, was released by Tin House. She had surgery today and she's doing well. I regret that she's not here, so I'm going to read a poem once more about Saudi Arabia, about being a woman from there, and I'm going to dedicate it to her because she was there the whole time when we were growing up, through wars and oil booms and everything. So this is a ghazal. It's a formal poem. I like to write in them because it's a really good way to capture the sort of the rhythms of Arabic, the Arabic language. So I know the people here in this crowd, so you know what a ghazal is. I trust you. Morning. Do you remember those mornings we couldn't even morning? All our verbs were hard-edged. We sharpened our teeth on the morning. Morbid girls untangling from ancestral lines, a pathway rigid like the tracks of the fabled Ottoman railway exploding in the morning. In our Hijaz, girls grew from crescent to crescent. The night was a band cafe we filled with cigarettes until morning. So many words for fragrant smoke. I recall a gilt wedding tray filled with crystal jars of oud and the tale of a friend asleep on her prayer rug by morning. Some of us wed, some of us left that Hijaz. Some of us are lost in Western mother tongue. The Western side of the world spins you clockwise at morning. Over many rooftops, the world glitters for us in a sky bereft of minarets. Majda, name the stars. Stars, name the girls who rise to sing new prayers to the morning. So I seem to be doing okay for time, but my throat is not happy. Excuse me. I'll read something new. Being hybrid and looking like I'm not really from anywhere in specific, i.e. ethnically ambiguous. A lot of people don't often believe my story or my poems or my name. So this is a poem that replies to that. It is called, When It Is Implied by a Woman Not From My Country That I Am Not From My Country. How old were you when you learned to tie your scarf? And why do you ask if my hijab is still black? In the desert, Ibrahim points to a baby camel, 1 day old. The females are turned loose into the desert to give birth. There are 2 kinds of gazelle, reem and thubi, but one oryx, maha. Some of these are the names of girls I grew up with. The hudhud has flown west. A bulbul sits at my closed window. If I open myself with the glass, will it fly in? The food I carry from country to country, the sand trapped in the soles of shoes, the currency I never can convert. Two more poems, I think. This is another poem about girls in the desert. Can't escape it. It's called Tala, Ode to the Girl Palm. And in Arabic, the word Tala refers to the girl palm. It's also the name of my cousin's youngest daughter. When I ate the fruit of the date palm delivered fresh to me from an oasis in the empty quarter, admired the gilt-twined bag the fruit lay in, and hesitated to disturb this wonder of Arab irrigation, fruit bat pollination, and desert patience, I knew why fathers send their daughters to the West with kilos of dates, sukari, khudri, sigai, heavily wrapped and suspicious in luggage. The care in the fruit meant to last us in places where trees drop all their leaves and appear dead to the eye. I eyed my gift, portioned myself one to eat on a balcony, casting a cool shadow over sand, speckled with blood and feathers from a wild falcon kill. Knew I could have sent that falcon into the sky to feed. Knew that to the east in the oasis, young girl palms were sheltering, growing, while men in white bathe and dress them, name them, and then let the desert raise them. This is my last poem. Ellen mentioned it, and yeah, the themes of migration are threaded through here, as well as the cities that my family moved through. Ascenseur. I last saw my grandmother at the end of a century that ended many countries. The world cities became unreliable, changing name or sect. A tiny woman in perpetual white. I have seen the sepia photograph of her in the early 1940s wearing a floral gown, the picture hand-painted in color. I can't be sure she ever wore anything but the same tob and tarha, memory being mine. Ascenseur, she said, in this early century, on seeing an elevator in her son's new Beirut home. When we all lived in Alexandria, the lift that moved us between floors jarred and stopped short below our floor. A Haris pulled us up hand by hand in the old century. Would she understand the way I grasp at places, the rope between our family knotted thinly, or yearn for cities that hold figments of our baits? By Marble Arch, young uncles with slicked back hair walk toward a Roman road, turning onto Edgware with its cafes serving gahwa and hand-pounded fruit tobacco. Up Alexandrine stairs comes the metronome sound of slippers. In every decade, one of us walks down the same street. I last saw my grandmother in Beirut, not where she was born, but where I was born and am not from. That is the Arab condition. Thank you.
Thank you, Majda. That was really lovely. And it was wonderful to hear you read. Now, WordWorks' Karen Alanier will lead our poets in a question and answer session.
Well, I am so pleased to have this program open with such a strong set of poems and poems by women who stand strong, whether it's in the desert or other places. And I was thinking that we've heard a lot tonight about the politics of gender. And I was wondering if both of you could talk to the younger women poets behind you and what advice you would give them relative to standing strong like you do. Shall we start with Leila?
Sure. That's a great question. I care a lot about gender, and I think it's something that I don't know that we always talk about the ways it's still impacting, I think, young women and all of us. Early on, when I was first starting to write the poems for Deluge, I was warned not to. I'd been told by a male authority that there would be no interest for them, and that editors would not want to publish work that was dealing graphically with the female body. And I was young. I was 23, 24 when I was starting to write these poems. And I was really afraid of that. I was afraid of not being taken seriously. And I was afraid of being sort of labeled as, hysterical. So I didn't send those poems out for a long time. I was sending out poems about other things. And when I realized that these poems were not going away, that what had originally been 10 or 15 poems was steadily becoming a larger project, which was encouraged by my mentor, Dorianne Lux, a wonderful poet older than myself, who had been my professor. And when she told me that this was actually the beginning of my book and not, a chapbook as I had thought it was, I was mortified. I thought that that would ruin my career to have a first book that was so clearly female. So I made a terrible decision, which is that I thought that I would send out only to 5 places, and I chose very, very competitive places. And if those places weren't interested in the poems, then I would abandon the project. I was doing it to sort of sabotage myself. But luckily, the first poem in the collection, Confession, was accepted by one of those places. And that sort of was my sign that I should continue the project. That's a horrible bit of advice. So my advice to young women is like, don't sabotage yourself. Don't create these, tricks to trick yourself out of what you're working on. Some of my, most enthusiastic supporters have been men. So that professor was very wrong. My editor is a man, and many of the journals that these poems have been published in have been, male poetry editors. So I think the lessons for me were that you never know your audience. I think I had thought that the only people who would possibly be interested in my book would be a very narrow subset of like Arab Muslim women who also struggle with fertility, a very, very small population. But that's not at all what the case was, luckily. I think that we all have so much in common about, illness and faith and doubt and, desire and fear and all these things that are human. And coming at it from a specific lens doesn't take away from that. It makes it more rich. So I think, write your poems. I'm happy to read very, very feminine poems, and I know that there are a lot of people who are also doing that. So if I can help in any way by telling you that your fears are probably in your head, I hope that's helpful.
Well, wonderful answer. And I commend you for your bravery and your belief, because unless you believe in yourself, it's hard to move forward. Majda, what would you like to say to the younger women behind you?
Well, I was a poetry editor for a few years. So what I told them when I was doing that was yes, constantly yes. There was nothing too raw, embarrassing, or graphic or confessional for me. And I just unfortunately burnt out too quickly and stepped down from that position. But Thuraya Al-Muntasir, who I think is here, who her debut book of poetry won the Walt Whitman Award. She is now the poetry editor after me. And I felt really pleased that was the turn of events that happened. So what I would say is, if you feel like you're not publishing or being heard, and that's entirely normal, kind of slip through the cracks in different ways, become an editor, a reader, open doors. And the more you open doors for the other women, younger women, trans women, non-binary folk, the more doors will open for you.
Wonderful answer. that is true. When you open doors for other people, those doors do open for you. I mean, I've got a lifetime, of those kinds of wonderful experiences. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. I think we have some very amazing people in our audience tonight. And, if this was a live event, I would pull out some people and have them, contribute to this conversation. But I think we have had such an amazing set of poems that we need to have space around them to contemplate what we've heard tonight. They were wonderful. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ellen to conclude.
Thank you, Karen. And that was a very interesting discussion. I have to say that gender is very important to older women also. So don't forget us. Leila and Majda, was truly remarkable reading. And I'm so glad we were able to hear it. Michael, thank you again for your music. And thanks also to Karen Alanier and the WordWorks for sponsoring Cafe Muse, to Henry Crawford for his technical magic, and to our guest co-host, Susan Oakey, and my fellow co-hosts, Renee Garrity, Leah Johnson, Henry Crawford, and Majda Gama. Most importantly, thanks to all of you for being here for tonight's program. Without you, Cafe Muse couldn't exist. If you want to watch tonight's program again, it will be up on Cafe Muse's YouTube channel tomorrow. And you can extend your enjoyment by purchasing Leila's book, the link is in the chat, and by reading many of Majda's poems online, and by letting others know about the series. Please join us for the WordWorks Poet versus the Pandemic program on Wednesday, January 12th at 7 o'clock, featuring Sarah Marin with guest hosts Sylvia Lady Di Beverly and Allison Palmer. And I hope you will also join us for the next Cafe Muse program in February. And I misspoke before. The correct date is Monday, February 7th. Featuring poets Sandra Beasley and Maurice Manning. Please make sure you've registered on our Cafe Muse website so that you'll receive information on the event as well as the Zoom link. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, healthy and happy and poetic New Year, and I hope we'll see you soon.